Libraries 2.0 conference. I hope you can all hear me all right. If not, please chat and they will let me know. Of course, if you can't hear me, you didn't know to do that. So that was terrible advice on my part. I apologize. My name is Patrick PC Sweeney. I am the political director for Every Library. If at any time throughout this presentation, you have a question for me, or if you have a question for me in the next days or weeks to come, or if you'd like to connect with Every Library for some of our services to help out your library politically, you can always send me an email at patrick.sweeney@everylibrary.org. And of course, on social media, I'm PC Sweeney. You can find me on just about any social media platform as PC Sweeney. Feel free to ask me questions on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, I don't care. I am here to answer your questions. So let's get started here and start talking about political power and influence and how important this is for libraries. Let's talk about first a little bit about this presentation. So this presentation is actually built out of basically what was my first experience in librarianship. Now, I got hired out of college for a job that I had no business doing, but they were paying so little that nobody else wanted to do it. I got the opportunity to open up a brand new 40,000 square foot joint use facility between the city, the high school district, the community college. And it was a great experience, except it was 2007 when we opened the library. I got to fill it, when I first got there, it was concrete and drywall, and I got to fill it with books. I got to set policy. It had been run by volunteers for years. And so I got to set forth like the website, the policy, hire and train staff, and do all these really amazing things. However, 6 months after we opened, we hit the recession. Lincoln, California was hit terribly bad by the recession. And in fact, I had to lay off 6 of the staff, of the 12 staff that I had hired, which was a really interesting time because watching organizations, the other community organizations, the other city-funded organizations like the police, like fire, like Parks and Rec, navigate through this environment of a economic collapse was fascinating because the organizations that got funded weren't the ones that were most important. The organizations that got funded were the ones that had the most political power, the ones who were most well organized, the ones who knew how to build coalitions, who had partnerships, who had the things that they need in place structurally in order to convince city council to not defund them. And of course, the biggest organization in the community that benefited the most from this was the police. Everybody had to take 15% furloughs. None of us got our cost of living increases. I wasn't allowed to hire staff. If I lost staff in the library, I wasn't allowed to replace them. It was a really devastating time. The police kept their COLA. They got to keep hiring. In fact, they got to increase their hiring and all kinds of things like this simply because they were very, very good at organizing the community around their cause. Now, I say that because in Lincoln, California, there hadn't been a violent crime in over like 20 years at this point. There was really no crime to speak of in this community. So the staff, the police were they're one of the highest paid police organizations in the Sacramento area. So like just giving you this background, this is really where this is coming from, learning from this, because right now we are facing, I think, that same kind of crisis. We're losing sales tax right now, which a lot of our libraries are funded on. We're going to be asked to take significant cuts. States where a lot of the funding for libraries comes from the state revenue or is passed down from the state are being asked to take 20% cuts. We need to be able to address this, to organize our communities and fight back against these cuts to keep the funding that we need in order to continue to serve our community. A little bit about Every Library and our background real quick. We are a 501c4 organization. Everything that we do for libraries is done for free, pro bono. We are here to offer you the things you need in order to organize your community, to build political power and influence for your library, to ensure that you have the funding you need to continue to serve your community. We offer data, digital support, funding for campaigns, campaign consulting, campaign support. We have wide networks that we can share with you, with communities and organizations that can lend their political power to you as well. All you have to do is send me an email and ask, quite honestly, and we can get started helping you out in any of your crises. And we have a lot of tools to help you out. Again, it's all for free. We're just here to give you things for free. So why learn from politics? Well, this is really the critical piece. And one of the things that I learned, especially in that Lincoln situation, is that I had no idea where my paycheck came from. Nowhere in library school did they teach me how to influence the things that ensured that I got a paycheck. And I think that structural, oops, somebody's requesting remote control of my screen. I don't know why. I don't know why we have that deficiency of knowledge within our education system around libraries. We don't teach librarians where their paycheck comes from. We don't teach librarians how to influence that. And this is really critical because 98% of library funding is political in nature. 98%, the biggest, by far, the biggest piece of the pie for library funding is political. About 90% comes typically from the local voters and local politicians on average across the country. 3 to 5% typically comes from the state. 3 to 5% comes from the federal government. And of course, in different states, there's different pieces of the pie on that. In some places it's higher, lower, whatever, but still typically philanthropic funding for libraries or other sources of funding for library only accounts for about 2% of library funding, which means if we want to keep library funding, we have to understand how to influence that 98% of library funding, which is political in nature, which means we have to learn how to navigate this political environment that we operate in. So let's talk about this real quick because this is critical data. If you've heard me speak before, you're going to be familiar with these first couple of slides here because this needs to be said over and over and over again. In 2008, there's only been 2 studies that ever measured library political support for library funding in this country. Only 2 in the entire existence of librarianship. We've only measured this twice. This is a terrifying scenario that we're in where we have no idea. We've never studied this. None of our organizations have studied it. Nobody has influenced politics in the library industry. And this is the first time we've actually even measured it. And this was done by OCLC and the Gates Foundation. In 2008, it's a study called From Awareness to Funding. And in 2008, what they found is that 37% of voters would definitely vote yes for library. That's great. 37% are likely to vote yes for the library. And what that likely to vote yes means is that these are people who are willing to vote for the library if they get some of their questions answered. And they're legitimate questions typically. Who's spending their money? What's it being spent on? Is there accountability? You know, all those kinds of questions. If you can answer those questions, they will very likely move into your vote yes category. Then, of course, in 2008, 26% of the population were terrible people. These are people who are going to vote against libraries. Now, the interesting thing here is it doesn't matter if the library cures cancer. It doesn't matter if no puppy ever gets sick again. If libraries are funded, they're still going to vote against libraries because they have a fundamental belief about government and taxes, right? 26%. Now, then we hit the recession. All this data was pulled from 2007. The report was released in 2008. Let's see what happens in 2018. We lost 10% of the definitely vote yes for the library community. We lost 10%. We lost 6% of the likely to vote yes for the library group. And we're up to 42% of Americans are likely or definitely going to vote no against library funding. This is devastating to us. And one of the things that I often hear is like, well, you know, library campaigns are passing at about the same rate they've always been passing. Well, number one, we don't know because the only database of library ballot measures that we have is done by every library, and it only goes back to 2012. So we don't know if we're doing better or worse. It's remained fairly steady, but that's largely because we're still at 42% of the population is likely to vote no. If this trend continues and we get above 50%, which is the threshold for most states for vote passage, once that 42% no gets above 50% across the country, we are going to start drastically losing library campaigns and elections and drastically losing funding. So the citation, if you guys just, this is all from Awareness to Funding. If you just Google Awareness to Funding, you are going to get this data. And these are great reports. Everybody should read them, by the way. Also from this report, this is just a pullout that I use. We lost, if you look in 2008 to 2018, our super supporters, the people who support libraries above like all else, we lost about 0.6%. The segment of them that would vote yes went down 16%. We lost 16% of our super supporters' willingness to vote for us. However, what's really interesting, if we go all the way over, we see that percentage who rate libraries positively, it went up 9%. They like libraries more than they've ever liked them before. They're just less willing to tax themselves for them. Percent who rate librarians positively, it went up. Probable supporters, we lost 7% of our probable supporters. We lost 11% who would be willing to vote for us. They rate libraries just as much as they ever did before. They rate librarians less. I'm not going to go into that too much, but we can have another discussion about that another time. The thing is here, people like libraries as much as they ever have before. They're just less likely to vote for them. And what this means is that our advocacy, if our measurement of advocacy that we're doing in this country is that people like libraries more, we're doing a great job. If our measurement of success for our advocacy is that we have the funding we need in order to keep our doors open, we are wildly failing. So we have to have a real discussion about this issue right now. The other interesting thing is that political party doesn't matter. Looking at the data, the moderate majority of Americans on the progressive and on the conservative side are just as likely to vote yes or no for libraries. We can go real deep into this. I'm not going to take a lot of time with it, but political party really doesn't matter when it comes to who's willing to vote yes or no for libraries. They both vote yes or no for libraries at nearly the same rate. And we're seeing that slip a little bit right now, but for the large part, it really doesn't matter. The minority that you hear that are screaming and shouting about taxes and voting against libraries, that's really the minority. And those are the people in the fringe groups on the edges, not that moderate majority in the middle. Card statistics don't matter. Library campaigns that have high cardholder rates in their community are just as likely to pass or fail as communities that have low cardholder rates. We've seen libraries lose with 30% cardholder rates and lose with 80% cardholder rates just as often as we've seen libraries win with 30% cardholder rates or 80% cardholder rates. Again, this is all from the Awareness to Funding study. The other interesting thing is that library use doesn't matter. And this is something that we really have to think about here. Library use just doesn't matter when it comes to library funding. I can't tell you how many times I've worked on a campaign, gone into the library, talked to somebody who was sitting down using the library and said, oh, are you going to vote yes for the library? You're here. And they're like, no, absolutely not. Nobody ever uses the library. And I hear that over and over and over again. I also hear so many times from people using the library, I love the library, but I don't believe in taxes. I don't believe in government. There's no correlation between library use and people's willingness to vote to tax themselves for libraries. And we really need to understand that because a lot of our advocacy work is built on ensuring that that we're getting people to use the library in order to get them to support the library. It just doesn't work like that. The other thing to remember, like, how many libraries do you know that are named after somebody who probably hasn't stepped in a library for 30 or 40 years? Like, there are big donors, big money people, powerful and influential people who are just not going to ever use your library simply because they don't need to, but they will donate millions of dollars to your library because they believe fundamentally that's a good thing for the community, right? Library use just doesn't matter when it comes to library support. Now, the one thing that does matter above and beyond all other things in librarianship that drives people and motivates them to actually stand up out of their seat and go take action on behalf of libraries is people's relationship and belief about their librarian. And when I say librarian, I mean everybody that the public believes is a librarian. And that means all library workers. That means everybody on your board of trustees. That means your volunteers. That means anybody who's ever worked in or around a library at any point in their life. The public believes they're all librarians. And if your library is well connected on a human to human level, you have greater political power and influence. I'm going to dive into that in just a minute when I talk about kinds of supporters. But remember that if you really want to build public support, the number one thing you can do is go out and meet as many people as you possibly can. So what does that mean? So if we think about this, 98% of library funding is based on the willingness of the voters and the local politicians. Our jobs are dependent upon that tax funding that they are deciding on, which means whether or not I like it, I am a political candidate for my job. And we really need to start thinking about our jobs in sort of this political sense. We are candidates, we are the incumbent for our job. If we were running a political campaign, we'd be considered the incumbent, right? And we need to think about how we interact with the public as part of a political campaign. And once you start doing that, you start thinking about this and the way that we interact with our public, you start understanding how to build the same political power and influence that organizations like the police have in order to drive up their funding, right? Like the reason that they have so much funding and the reason libraries have so little is primarily because they're well organized. The police have been doing this for years and years and years. And here also from Awareness to Funding study, nothing that I'm saying here is original. This all comes from Awareness to Funding study. What they said is that we need to cultivate and empower our super supporters. This is absolutely fundamentally true. Over and over again, what we see, and there's a number of studies to prove this, but it only takes 3.5% of the public to move to move a community towards change. Only 3.5%. We don't need everybody in the community to be on our side. We need 3.5% of our community willing to take action on our behalf. And if we look at the data, this is great news for us, right? I'm going to scroll back real quick because I got to show this. Our super supporters are 7.1%. So if we get just half of our super supporters, we're going to be doing really well in our communities, okay? Now, one of the things that they did say though here, they said cultivate and empower super supporters. I added the word identify. And the reason I added the word identify is because we have absolutely no idea in librarianship who our super supporters are. We have no data about what a super supporter looks like. What is their demographic makeup, their racial profile? What is, do they drive red Subarus or do they drive blue Toyotas? I don't know. We have no idea. And not being able to identify who our super supporters are is the single biggest thing that's driving down our political power and influence. We have to know who we are if we want to engage with them, if we want to cultivate and empower them. We have zero data about it. So here's the deal. Advocates have 3 resources. And once you start thinking about your political work, your advocacy work is an equation of 3 different resources, which means if you spend one of these resources, you better get a lot out of the other 2. So if I'm spending my time doing something, I am identifying people or I'm raising money, okay? If I'm spending money, I am identifying people, okay? If I'm working with people, and people can lend you their time, so the more volunteers you get, the more time your campaigns get. If I'm engaging with people, I better be using people like my volunteers. They better be increasing donations, or they better be finding more people. If we don't have these resources, we don't have political power or influence. And we need political power if we want libraries to stay open. There's no other way to think about it. There's no other way to say this. You have to have political power if you want libraries to stay open. Now, we always talk about like, and I keep hearing this over and over and over again. If we just tell good stories, we'll get funded. If people just know the data behind how important libraries are, we'll get funded. And that's just simply not the case. And that's never been the case. And in fact, if people funded things simply because they were good, then we would have a much different country than we're living in right now, right? People don't fund things simply because they're good. They fund things because there's something to gain, there's something to build, because that organization has political power and influence. This is like lobbying. This is every kind of community organizing that you can think of. So where does political power come from? Now remember, you have 3 resources, time, money, and people. But political power really only comes from 2 resources, and that is people and that is money. You need one of those 2 things or you don't have political power. And we need to really understand that as an industry if we want to build our political power. So if I'm spending time on something, I better be getting that people money. Any activity that I do, I better be identifying, cultivating, and empowering our supporters through the work that I'm doing. And it's real easy. Like, it sounds burdensome. It sounds like we're adding a whole new thing to your work, but we're really not. It's very, very simple things. I'll talk about that in just a second. You need to have identified super supporters in your community if you want to have political power. Now, of course, like, we're probably not going to have millions of dollars as an industry to fight on our side anytime soon. But because 80% of the public is favorable towards the libraries, we can probably get a lot of people on our side. We can be like a people-powered pack, right? What do we have? Guess what? We have none of these things. No organization in this country, not one, not ALA, no state or associations, nobody has built a national database of library supporters, a national database of library supporters that can be immediately called upon whenever libraries are threatened. Nobody has ever built this before. No state associations, no advocacy organizations. Every library is building it. We have almost 200,000 emailable human beings. So if a library is threatened, we can send an email out to 200,000 Americans. We aren't politically powerful unless we have over 1 million, quite honestly, as a national organization. In your states, in your locality, whatever 3.5% of your population is, that should be your target for your identified supporters. We also don't have money. As an industry, of course, a lot of our big organizations are in a lot of trouble right now with COVID, with loss of sales revenue, with loss of jobs, which means loss of membership to a lot of our associations, which means loss of money, which means it's a loss of political power, right? And this is really significant. You should be supporting your associations as much as you can, because those are the organizations that have the rightful voice and they're the rightful stakeholders in a lot of your states. Every library is here to back up your associations and help them with their agendas on the state and national levels. We don't do anything ourselves. So please support your associations. And honestly, we're running out of time. Remember, we're up to 42% of Americans are unwilling to vote for libraries, 42%. If that gets above 50 in the next couple of years, that's about it. We're about done, okay? So we are out of time. We also don't have any data about who supports libraries or why. The organizations that are anti-tax and anti-government that gained a lot of power in 2008 have huge data sets about almost every American in this country and how to talk to them, which ones to talk to, what to talk to them about, in what format to talk to them through, what platforms to talk to them through. They know to send these people direct mail that talks about this, using these colors and this symbol and this ideology in order to motivate them to take action on their behalf. You know, and they're turning that those systems on against libraries. We've seen the Koch brothers funded Americans for Prosperity come out against libraries a number of times. We don't have the data, the money, the people, the time to fight AFP. You know, we have to start right now. So our strategy is to get supporters. It's not to get users, it's to get supporters. And the great thing about having a strategy that's getting supporters in your community instead of getting users is that people who have a propensity for using the library on their path to becoming a supporter, guess what? They will use the library. So you will build users while aiming for supporters. Supporters is just one above library use. While you're building support, you will get more library users, but target getting more supporters. Now you have 4 kinds of supporters in a community. You have relational, ideological, aversion, and access. If you've done any kind of campaign work, fundraising, whatever, you will see this. Relational supporters are the people closest to you, the people you know. Remember, I said in the very beginning, people who know the library, the single most motivating thing to get people to support the library is a relationship and belief about the librarians. That is those people closest to you. Ideological supporters are the people who are favorable to your cause, who have the same ideas as you. Aversion supporters are people who support the library because they're against something else. I vote for Hillary because I'm against Trump, or Trump because I'm against Hillary, not necessarily because I'm for either one. We don't have access supporters. I'm going to skip it because we don't have time. But you have to build your list of supporters. If somebody tells you that, yes, I support the library, and you don't write their name and email address down at the very least, they are not your supporter. You cannot count them as a supporter. You have to write down name and email address of everybody who supports your libraries. And there's easy passive ways to do this. Pass around a clipboard story time. making sure that you're actively passing out clipboards when you're doing outreach, all of those kinds of things, building up that supporter list. This is really something that your friends group or foundation can do really well for you. It is all about getting as many people as you possibly can. We have this problem though right now with our messaging model. Everything we're doing in librarianship is very one directional. And the reason that I love librarians and librarianship so much is because we're so willing to give so much away and ask for nothing in return. And what we're seeing is that this is really detrimental to us. This is kind of old school thinking. If we tell people good things about libraries, they will just do things for us. And that is not the case. There's too many other things attracting their attention. We have to drive them to take them action, to drive them to action. My dad used to wear the shirt when I was a kid, and I found it online. So this is the problem with this model. Once again, like I just said, is you tell a great story, then we think some miracle occurs, and then we have library funding. Well, that whole piece in there is the part that we're missing. And this is learning about politics and library funding and understanding how ladders of engagement work, building coalitions. This is about identifying supporters. This is about building partnerships. This is about new funding models and revenue streams specifically for advocacy. This is about data around who supports libraries and why. Like there's so much that we have to do in this, then a miracle occurs part that we're just not doing. And if we don't do it, we're running into a lot of problems. We're really risking running into a lot of problems too. An effective model of advocacy and activism asks for something back in every activity. If you are doing advocacy in your library and it costs you more money than you're spending, you are doing something wrong with your advocacy. If you're spending more money on Libraries Transform than you are getting back from those Libraries Transform posters, you're doing those wrong. You should any activity from a Facebook post, from a story time, to anything that you're doing, you should always ask for something back. And some people complain about that with like every library's work. Like every email that goes out has a donate button. Every email that goes out has an ask for volunteers. Every post on our Facebook page has a donate button on the bottom. Every single one. Because any time that I'm spending any of my valuable resources as an organization, time, money, or people, I better be getting more back than I'm spending. So my big recommendation to you is to think about this as you're doing your work. What can I get back from this interaction? What can I do to ensure that I have the resources I need to keep my doors open and continue to serve my public with my good work? And if you start thinking about that and start thinking about this as an equation of time, money, and people, you'll start to see some of the strategies that lead to advocacy success. I don't have a lot of time to dive really deeply into a lot more stuff, but if you really want to get into it, if you go to everylibraryinstitute.org, again, I'm going to type it in the text box, but everylibraryinstitute.org. We have a whole bunch of free webinars that you can do to really dive deeply into the tactics and strategies around building up support beyond just what I've talked about in this webinar. Of course, we have our books available from ALA, Winning Elections and Influencing Politicians, and Before the Ballot, Building Political Support for Library Funding. Please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to follow up with me. You can find me online as PC Sweeney. You can also shoot me an email anytime you like, patrick.sweeney@everylibrary.org. I am here to help your library secure the political power and influence that it needs to continue its funding. And I think I'm about out of time. I have 1 minute for a question if you need one. But again, you can always follow up with me on social media. Thanks so much, team.